Hello, and welcome to the South Asia Hydromet Forum video podcast. Hydromet modernisation is frequently supported by both multilateral and bilateral development agencies. While the motivation of each may differ, the overall aim is to improve the capabilities of a country to cope with the impact of extreme weather, climate and hydrological events and contribute to social and economic development. These efforts may focus on complete upgrading of a meteorological or hydrological service, or may focus on individual components of the hydromet value chain, observational networks, numerical prediction, forecasting or services. In this episode, we explore how different development partners go about hydromet modernisation, how they collaborate with each other, and potential ways to enhance this collaboration. Alice Suarez speaks with colleagues from the Met Office, Met Norway and ECMWF on how their agencies have supported development projects in South Asia.
Welcome to the South Asia Hydromet Forum video podcast. Continuous support to national meteorological and hydrological services is required to ensure that they respond to the increased demands for improved products and better services in support of social and economic sectors of countries coping with climate change and other challenges. I would like to ask each of you in turn to describe the scope of your agency's investment in hydromet space. What are your respective agencies trying to achieve in South Asia region? Ellen, let me start with you. What did you hope to achieve with UK Met Office activities under the Asia Regional Resilience to a Changing Climate, the ARC program? What were the main challenges you have faced and how did you overcome them?
Great, thanks Alice. So the ARC Met Office Partnership Programme aims were to strengthen weather and climate resilience in South Asia, so through the co-production of weather and climate services, building institutional capacity and enhancing coordination across the region with a particular focus on the countries of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal and Pakistan. And we broke that down into several work packages that worked across all of the weather and climate timescales. So work package 1 aimed to implement impact-based forecasting, or IBF, on weather timescales, so supporting disaster risk reduction and decision-making to address key weather hazards. On seasonal timescales then, we had the Strengthening Climate Information Partnerships for South Asia, or SCIPSA, and that aimed to support the South Asian Seasonal Climate Outlook Forum, which issues seasonal climate outlooks for the region and helps weather and climate services build a seasonal capability through new approaches. Then work package 3 was the Climate Analysis for Risk Information and Services in South Asia, or CARISA, and that was aimed at improving the uptake of climate change information across the region. And finally then, working across all of those was the work package for Value Strand, and that aimed to try and quantify the socioeconomic benefits of weather and climate information services. So, as you would expect, across a 4-year programme, there were a number of challenges that we faced. Probably the biggest one that came along was COVID-19 and the travel restrictions imposed as a result of that. So that introduced a number of challenges, especially for training activities, especially where participants might have had limited access to appropriate IT or high-speed internet. So while ARC as a programme was relatively quickly able to innovate and make use of online tools and approaches to continue to deliver the aims and objectives, especially around training and capacity development, The lack of reliable internet and the availability of people to maybe work effectively away from their office environment did prevent some sort of progress in some areas. But in other instances, it did actually enable broader participation in helping to achieve better gender balance and efficiencies, enabling more facilitators to actually contribute to the training. Those impacts kind of stress the importance of effective internet-based communication and collaboration as we move forward for the future development of these services. And I think it's challenged us to kind of shift with our working practices and better adopt new technologies and innovate to reach new audiences. Another challenge was probably the pressures on the national meteorological and hydrological services themselves, who often had limited resources to develop new weather and climate services, in addition to maintaining their commitment to operational responsibilities. Also, we found that across South Asia, there probably was limited knowledge and understanding of how existing services were maybe used amongst target users. So when developing the IBF approach, we found that while the National Met Services might be the provider of the weather information, it was more often than not a one-way feed of information with little or no communication coming back to them from the users. And so that engendered a lack of awareness on how the forecasts were used, how they might be of benefit in certain sectors. And so to address this, we held a lot of stakeholder meetings across all work packages, but especially at the outset, so that the Met Services could get to know their users, their requirements from a weather and climate service, and specifically around how we could help them to implement mitigations ahead of severe weather. So what were the useful lead times? What weather information did they need? What risk appetite did they have towards weather and climate? To inform, in particular, any new IBF service that we pilot. Another one then was that while many of the services we worked with had a nominal, say, national mandate for providing, say, climate information to government, the public, or other organisations, they did often lack the capability and the knowledge to do so fully and confidently. Maybe a practical challenge of that was just how to manage large climate data sets, which required, substantial computational facilities and expertise to store and maintain. So some of the activities across Work Package 2 and 3 specifically helped to address some of these challenges through tailoring training and development of new tools. But obviously a sustained effort beyond the life of any one programme is necessary to kind of embed these into everyday practices. And the same can be said for access to a broader range of weather information in a suitable format. So we tried to help address this in part by increasing awareness of tools and resources that existed maybe through the regional centres. And I think then the final challenge that is important to highlight is probably more unique to the South Asian context, but you're in a region that has the Himalayas and the Indian Ocean dominating the nature of the weather and climate hazards. And so that complex topography obviously affects the reliability and the availability of observations. So how do we work with the kind of constraints that imposes on model forecasts and projections? And so we did spend a lot of time considering how to address these limitations and how to kind of build capacity in that lack of understanding.
Thanks, Ellen. Very comprehensive program, and thank you for all these points that you raised that are critical for our discussion. I move on to Christine. Met Norway has been working with the National Meteorological and Hydrological Services of Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka. Can you describe what type of activities you have supported and what challenges did you have overcome?
We support activities related to strengthening the NMHSs and their ability to focus extreme weather events and build climate services. And I have to say that the level of skill and knowledge in geophysics and mathematics is quite different in the institutions we have worked with. As an example, some of the meteorologists in Myanmar have a college level in meteorology, but in Vietnam, many of them are on a master level and some with a PhD as well. So we support a wide range of of activities from advanced verification of wave models, results from wave models by satellite measurements, to building really basic knowledge in meteorology. I also have to say that a really important part of National Met Service is modern digital tools. For this work, we only use tools also in use by meteorologists and researchers at Met Norway. And some of them are also developed in-house in our institutes. All these tools are open source and freely available on the internet, on GitHub. There are no fees or yearly maintenance costs related to these tools. And this means when the project is finished, they will be available and free to use. And this is sustainable, I think, for these projects. There's also a basic element that in every collaboration project, the project needs a foundation of trust and respect amongst the partners. There's a huge difference in culture and also in language and other things amongst the project participants. So we need to bridge this gap. So we work in small groups and we spend a lot of time on building trusts. Some of these projects, even small in scale, we have done them for more than 10 years, for instance, in Bangladesh. And when we manage to build this trust, people can relax. They are allowed to make mistakes, and they can try over again until they manage a new task, for instance. Another big challenge, which Helen touched upon, is the lack of digital knowledge, I would call it. We often spend a lot of time doing training sessions in elementary tasks like installing a new operational system, installing a new version of a program, understanding a basic script or program. And this is really useful knowledge because when something fails, and it does, someone needs to know how to start over again. Yeah, so that is what I like to say.
Thank you, Christine. You raised good points and quite different than those raised by Ellen, and all of them are important. The trust aspect, the sustainability are two critical issues. We move on with Humberto. The European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasts has a memorandum of understanding with the Regional Integrated Multi-Hazard Early Warning System for Africa and Asia, RIMES. What are the activities under this MOU, and what are you trying to achieve in South Asia, different than what you are doing in other regions? And what do you see are the challenges you are facing and how to overcome them?
Well, ECMWF has been having this kind of cooperation agreement, as we call it, with the RIMES for over 10 years. And this agreement kind of came into force after already some experience in Bangladesh, actually, with a project on flood forecasting. And one of the issues there at that point was that the Bangladesh Met Service was not in a position to operationalize this flood forecasting system that was implemented with the help of ECMWF data. And then RIMES came along and ECMWF member state agreed that we could have a cooperation agreement where typically ECMWF provides the data and products to RIMES, and then it's up to RIMES, let's say, to use these products for the production of early warning system, and in particular taking over this activity on flood-related. In exchange, and this is the typical arrangement that ECMWF has in this type of agreements, what we want to get is mostly two things. One is feedback generally on the usefulness of the ECMWF data in that particular region. Well, ECMWF has a global weather forecast, but for us it's difficult, let's say, to know the performance of the forecast in all parts of the world, especially if in some parts of the world, so the observation network is not the best. And for that, in a way, we rely on the feedback from RIMES. But the other important aspect is to potentially encourage the distribution of additional observations in the network in general. So, but if necessary, maybe initially towards ECMWF and the member state of ECMWF. So these are the two main goals of having a cooperation agreement. Our experience is that I would say it's not easy to achieve some of these goals. The issue of the exchange of observation is clearly, I would say, in part linked to this, well, some aspect of the trust issue that has been mentioned. Maybe it's a different type of trust, but many countries, in some cases, have some issues of deciding to share these observations. And once you have sorted out maybe the trust aspect, the other issue I think to deal with is really the technicalities of actually doing that. And some of these are related to really lack of technical knowledge in the various Met services. Some are probably related as well to not particularly easy way of coding this type of observation and the use of this international network. So in that context, probably having an organization like RIMES that let's say consolidate a bit the knowledge or can maybe assist some of the Met services in doing that job may facilitate that work. Clearly, that there has been in recent years some work funded by the World Bank, in enhancing this data exchange platform that has been set up. I think there is still more work that needs to be done to actually take full fruition of the exchange, especially for what is probably the most important aspect, that would be the near real-time distribution of data.
Thank you, Umberto. You raised a few points that linked with issues that both Alan and Christine have raised as well. You mentioned the importance of feedback on the performance of models, and Alan mentioned about the complexity with the malarias and the ocean aspects in the region that complicate this aspect. You also mentioned aspects about exchange of observations and the work that we are doing at the regional levels. This brings to my next point, that cooperation among partners is not easy for several reasons, ranging from project timing to the overall objectives of each agency. Recently, the development community created the Alliance for the Hydromet Development to bring development partners together, but how does this translate into practical steps in the field? Ellen and Christine, I have the same question for you. How easy or difficult it is to work with other development partners, and what could we do to work together more effectively? Christine, can we start with you?
Yes, I have to say we haven't worked a lot with other development partners. But what I really miss is a database or library where we can find other similar or adjacent projects or activities in an easy way. And this, I think, would be really important for new people that are entering these programs and projects. Also, when we plan our activities, it would be really nice to know if there were other partner or development partners visiting the same institutions at the same time, because we have discovered this sometimes, and it would be nice to knew it before.
Yeah. Thank you, Christine. Ellen, what are your views?
Yeah, some great points raised there, and completely agree. I think maybe slightly differently, ARC by design actually aimed to kind of quite closely work with partner organisations to ensure a kind of effective implementation and to start to investigate pathways for sustainability beyond the kind of current ARC programme at both national and regional levels. But I definitely agree that the work to kind of find out some of those other partners that were working outside of those in the ARC programme was difficult. So what Kristen has said there would certainly have been beneficial. The partners that we set out to work with included the National Meteorological Services and scientific institutions or universities. There were regionally mandated organisations as well, the likes of RIMES, as we just discussed, or ICIMOD, as well as the regional centres for that area. UN bodies as well, so the World Meteorological Organization, the likes of UNESCAP and the World Food Programme, as well as then humanitarian sector organisations, the likes of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Centre, as well as development funders, including the World Bank. And I think having those partnerships for us was critical to get buy-in and to build trust, some of what we were talking about earlier, in the development of the Weather and Climate Service, so that it was a united kind of front to progress some of these initiatives. And there were certainly huge benefits to be had in working with those other development partners. The sharing of resources and knowledge, making sure programs were complementary, and utilising the different skills and experience of each partner within the arrangement. Obviously, it wasn't always smooth sailing. Difficulties might have been due to different timelines, perhaps different restrictions of the funding or the interventions that were in place, and just that lack of awareness or understanding of the others' aims and objectives and other work that was going on within the region. But I think in terms of working more effectively, certainly the most positive partnerships were those that we had regular communication with. So both aware of each other's plans and action to keep each other updated on any progress or delays. And perhaps where one project was coming to completion or a different timeline or a milestone reached, the sharing of the knowledge or the lessons learnt and a kind of handing over almost of outstanding issues could save a lot of time amongst the other partners in finding out some of that critical information. So you spin up a lot quicker. I think selecting the right partner to make use of the particular strengths and experience to kind of expedite and get value out of the implementations imposed, and also for the recipients, so whether that be the National Met Service or the regional bodies, it can sometimes be overwhelming to have so many projects and partners, and it can further stretch those already under pressure resources. So by working together, if we can kind of present a combined vision, showing ultimately how the programs are complementary rather than competing, and work together to deconflict the activities where possible, all of that then can help build better trust and probably get more momentum on kind of achieving some of the aims and objectives.
Thank you, Ellen. You brought very important points, and you not only talked about the bilateral collaboration, but also the regional aspects that are important, bringing the regional institutions and even at the global level. Talking about the regional aspects, so I move now to Humberto. Do you think there might be advantages in a more regional approach? For example, the regional observational networks, more emphasis on the regional modeling, like what happened in Europe in particular. Humberto, you represent a regional agency. So how do you see this regional approach working in South Asia?
Okay, so I mean, clearly ECMWF has a specific role and responsibility, and is funded by European countries, mainly for the purpose of providing this kind of medium-range weather forecast, and now extended and seasonal range. And this, I think, has been obviously a sort of a very positive experience in the last 40 or so years. In the context, I think, of the specificities of what you mentioned, of more related to observation and regional modeling, I think in Europe, the experience, I would say, that is more relevant is the experience organized by the UMETNet network. So really a cooperation, if you want, of the national Met services in Europe, specifically on a number of programs. And one of the important programs is on the observation side, both in terms of monitoring of the observation network, and in general of organizing that network in the most efficient way. So, for example, during the pandemic, one of the actions that was taken by UMETNet was to have maybe a few extra radio soundings done in specific regions to compensate for the lack of observation coming from aircraft that clearly were not flying anymore at that point in time. Similarly, there are some other activity on the forecasting side, even if in Europe you have a number of consortia in terms of regional modeling. So you don't have one regional modeling activity, but still there is a lot of more cooperation. And I would say that in every region probably of the world, some kind of cooperation in that area would help instead of having individual initiatives from each separate country without possibly knowing what another neighbor is doing. And in a number of cases, I mean, one could even go beyond that. In some of those countries, you wonder if it is relevant for them to have their national responsibility, well, to have their own regional model instead of maybe working together with neighbors and having something that is coordinated, which I think is something that is happening maybe not in South Asia, but more in Central Asia, for example, where maybe you have some countries that have a better infrastructure and can manage the model and assist the neighbors.
So. Thank you, Umberto. Very important point, and hopefully this is related to South Asia. Some of these lessons learned from Europe or Central Asia can also be used to implement such programs in South Asia. As we draw the conversation to a close, do you have any final thoughts on hydromet modernization in South Asia? I'll start with Umberto.
I would really strengthen what the message that was given of trying to have a more cooperation from the various partners that are doing this type of work. So having knowledge of all the programs, I think, would help, and trying to be as effective as possible in this area.
Thank you, Christine.
I think developing, if we manage to develop a culture of sharing, it would be really beneficial for all. And we have been talking about this, but for example, to share observations it could be amongst national institutions, it could be amongst development partners, and it could be amongst other countries, especially the neighboring countries, because the weather is either coming from a neighboring country or is moving towards a neighboring country. So I think this is one of the most important issues that we can address. And it's also perhaps needless to say, but a well-functioning and stable a fast internet connection is an essential building block in this work. And it's really needed to produce and disseminate extreme weather warnings. So these are my 2 points.
Thank you, Christine. Ellen?
So yeah, I think picking up on a couple of those points, going forward, the value of the equitable and sustainable partnerships. So continuing to enhance the knowledge sharing, and then looking to the future, how we actually move weather and climate information to more of a decision centered approach, and also then across the regions and within a country, the need to ensure that programs tree up to wider strategic frameworks to help ensure sustainability. So a couple of things on that. So extending climate services to think more about the impact of climate variability and perhaps some of the concerns of decision makers. So something like climate adaptation services, where there's the need to translate the climate information into policy relevant indicators. I think that's a new process for a lot of countries in the region. But can we take some of the IBF principles and approaches? So could they be adapted to, say, a climate impact service? But obviously that requires overcoming some of the challenges we've mentioned about the availability of relevant and reliable data and knowledge on the climate impacts. Thinking about all timescales under a changing climate in the future, we need to start thinking more about societal contexts and how they might change in the future as well. And those can help inform the future direction of both IBF services and climate services. So what extra vulnerabilities do we need to consider in the future, and what weather hazards are likely to become the dominant ones? And I think a big thing for us is the continuing to enhance institutional capacity. So for regional and national services to meet the growing needs and the demands of the stakeholders, there have been some arguments that say, you know, the staff needs to diversify and have specialists in impact, in adaptation, in vulnerability, in socioeconomics, in engineering. And I think while that's probably beyond some of the weather and climate services in South Asia at the minute, especially in the short term, that this idea of strengthening the partnerships that we've mentioned throughout this conversation to promote more of that interdisciplinary knowledge sharing. And that's certainly something that we would hope to be able to support across the region in the future.
Thank you, Ellen. So we have keywords here: knowledge exchange and sustainable partnerships. Basically, these are the keywords that I hear from the three of you. So thank you all very much for joining us today on this South Asia Hydromet Forum video podcast and your insights into the Hydromet modernization process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. In the second interview, I talk with colleagues Yuri Hirabayashi from the Japan International Cooperation Agency, Michael Ernst from the United States Agency for International Development, and Priyanka Disanayake from the World Bank on their collective efforts to support Hydromet development. Welcome to this SAF video podcast. I'd like to start by asking each of you to briefly summarize your agency's activities in South Asia and to put this into a specific context of one country, Sri Lanka, where your agencies have and continue to interact with each other. Yuri, perhaps you could go first. Tell us about some of JICA's activities in South Asia.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Yuri Hirabayashi. I worked in Sri Lanka, and I direct the JICA in Sri Lanka and the South Asia countries. So firstly, I'd like to mention about the Japanese experience in this field. Due to its geography, topography, and the climate, Japan is a disaster-prone country. That is very important point for also for South Asia and Sri Lanka. So usually our experiences, not only its government but also its people and for society has accumulated knowledge and experience on how to manage it, mitigate disaster risk from that view, Japan's many experiences to the South Asia and Sri Lanka. So we focus on especially in Sri Lanka, not only the infrastructure, but also the non-infrastructure measures. For example, the technical cooperation, of course, and the infrastructure development. So, of course, in the hydromet field in Sri Lanka. Yeah, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Yuri. Michael, among many projects, USAID has been active in introducing the concept of the weather-ready nation in South Asia. Could you elaborate a bit on this and your other activities in the region, and how do you see this fitting with other partners' activities?
Yes, well, first, I would like to thank you for inviting me to speak on this podcast for the South Asia Hydromet Forum and for your continuing support to improve coordination among development partners. My name is Michael Ernst, and I'm a Senior Hydrometeorological Hazards Advisor for USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. Now, for us as a humanitarian assistance organization, we are very concerned with the impacts of natural hazards and how to reduce them. We focus on reducing loss of lives and suffering. And when it comes to early warning systems, we focus on how to reduce the impacts on vulnerable populations. In this regard, we are very supportive of global efforts to implement end-to-end early warning systems that include impact-based forecasting, which move beyond forecasting what the weather will be to what the weather will do. Populations that have understandable advanced warning on what the weather will do to them and their communities are in a better position to act on that information to reduce any potential harm. In the USA, we call this process building a weather-ready nation. So internationally, we call it building weather-ready nations. It's all very much in line with and supportive of the World Meteorological Organization's efforts expanding the implementation of impact-based forecasting globally. The USAID NOAA Weather Ready Nations program aims to support countries to go beyond producing accurate forecasts and timely warnings to better understanding and anticipating the likely human and economic impacts and enable action to reduce impacts from severe weather. At the national level, the first steps towards becoming a weather-ready nation through impact-based forecasting are to bring the hydromet agencies responsible for forecasting, together with the disaster management agencies, our typical partner as a humanitarian agency responsible for impacts, to jointly develop risk matrices for different hazards such as floods and thunderstorms. Now, the NMHS provide meteorological and hydrological forecasts, while NDMAs provide detailed vulnerability and exposure information to develop potential human and economic impacts. Together, they decide on the likelihood of an event and develop appropriate warning levels based on the risk matrix. The NMHSs and the NDMAs jointly monitor and coordinate closely during events to issue appropriate levels of warning to save lives and reduce impacts. And of course, that's what we're after. And Sri Lanka itself represents a country with great capacity and its hydromet and disaster management organizations. So it's been a good candidate for the Weather Ready Nations program, which involves bringing technical assistance through NOAA and the California-based Hydrological Research Center. In addition to Weather Ready Nations, we've worked with WMO and National Meteorological and Hydrological Services on advancing early warning of flash floods through the flash flood guidance system for South Asia. This specific program includes Sri Lanka and provides guidance to hydromet forecasters on conditions that suggest flash floods are imminent to enable early warning and early action. Recently, we've also supported a program to strengthen last mile communication in South Asia with the Regional Multi-Hazard Early Warning Systems, or RIMES. And again, this is very much focused on the vulnerable populations that are faced with hazards and can benefit greatly from early warning. It's very important that all of our programs are well coordinated with development partners, and we work to ensure that by coordinating with NOAA, WMO, and World Bank's GFDRR on global activities, as well as engaging with the South Asia Hydromet Forum and RIMES regionally. When it comes to end-to-end early warning systems and impact-based forecasting, there is a great deal of work to do to strengthen all aspects of the early warning value chain. It's essential that all of our activities leverage existing capacities, especially in countries like Sri Lanka, local institutions, and any additional capacities that development partners contribute.
Thanks, Michael. Priyanka, you're the co-task team lead on the World Bank's Climate Resilience Program in Sri Lanka. Could you describe how this program aims to help Sri Lanka cope with extreme hydrometeorological events?
Yes, David, our engagement in Sri Lanka has been for a very long time, more than a decade, where we have built a lot of climate resilience and capacity building with the institutions, the main institutions who are responding and who are planning this forecasting and early warning and river basin management. So in this context, the new project will look at a holistic view where the focus or the end result is the impact-based warning message that is delivered to the communities, and they take action on time to protect lives and assets. So in this regard, this project that we have initiated, 92 million US dollars, will be implemented as a program, not even as a project. It has multiple phases in it. We're looking into various aspects of system strengthening and also having the impact on the ground. So where the agency collaboration is important, the government agencies, National Building Research Organization, Irrigation Department, Department of Meteorology, and Disaster Management Center. So these four agencies are the main agencies that are providing forecasting and early warning, has to be operated in a coordinated manner, and there has to be an integrated early warning system. And then working with different other development partners, and also USA JICA about their initiatives for the holistic weather warning system is extremely important, and not only focusing on weather-related hazards, we also look into multiple hazards where it can be extended to man-made as well as biological hazards as well in the future. So it's an adaptive system which can continue to evolve and deliver the best service for the people for their resilience. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Priyanka. So you both, you've all touched a little bit on the need for cooperation among development partners, and I'd like to explore that in a bit more detail. Clients, countries, sometimes perceive development partners as competitors, each vying for the attention of the client. A somewhat perverse outcome is that clients don't necessarily share information openly about new investments and projects initiated by one development partner with others. So this can result in multiple investments in the same thing. Perhaps the obvious is the purchase and installation of meteorological observations co-located at the same site. It can also extend to training and software with multiple solutions provided to the client. In most cases, human and financial resources are limited, so this approach can lead to problems. Michael, what are your thoughts on this? Have you experienced this, and what can we do, if anything, to improve coordination and cooperation among partners to avoid these kinds of situations?
Yes, David, as I've said before, it is essential that we leverage all capacities that exist and maybe be brought to the table by others. And so we can't afford the waste and overlap. There's a tremendous amount of work to do to harvest the maximum benefit out of early warning systems, and we simply can't afford waste or duplication of efforts. Our organization takes great efforts not to create duplicate systems, and we don't see ourselves competing with development partners in this space for the most part. I've been quite impressed by the efforts that partners are making to improve coordination. I think everyone realizes there is a problem or can be a problem and that we need to deal with it. I've been quite impressed by these efforts. And especially in this area of early warning system development support. And the South Asia Hydromet Forum is a good example of that. Through improved coordination, we can all learn from each other and provide better support where it is needed. We have seen great examples of cooperation among national governments, other donors and institutions. In the Caribbean, for example, National Meteorological Hazard Services, USAID, GFDRR, WMO, CRUISE, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, and others collaborate closely to implement different components of early warning and impact-based forecasting to address the gaps in early warning and early action. So it really, that type of unified approach is really quite useful, and I think really essential in this space. Since early warning system development involves an ever-changing assortment of scientific and technological advances, the coordination becomes increasingly important. As new technology is deployed, there will be successes and failures that can provide valuable lessons to advance the state of the practice. And that's for all of us, reduce hazard impacts and ultimately save more lives. There's just tremendous amounts that we can all learn the better we coordinate this and not overburden our clients, as it were.
Thanks, Michael. Priyanka, what are your thoughts?
In terms of coordination between the different development partners, because now we have been in discussion even when we started this climate resilience multi-phase program, how we can collaborate even for co-finance in different elements. And then we also have come across this Kandi Mahayangana highway, which was developed by another development partner. Then there were so many slope failures where the World Bank funded to rectify, and the mitigation was done successfully. So we can always complement to some of these efforts, even though initially we are not in agreement or we are not aligning our programs to the same mitigation or same activity. But even later on, we can find areas where we can collaborate and work together and even complement after one another and sequencing them in a way that it can be more efficient and there is no duplication. And rather than to avoid duplication, I would say to build on what they have done and to complement and to find the right fit and what are the synergies, and then to move up from there. That's it.
Thanks, Priyanka. Yuri, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, the important thing already mentioned by the Michael and the Priyanka I saw, but I also I also would like to add that one important point is that not only our partnership, but also mainly the initiative by, for example, Sri Lankan counterpart is very, very important, I think. So I'd like to mention about the Sri Lankan case. Yeah, during my working in Sri Lankan people, I thought that because, for example, mainly the disaster management center have a big initiative with many related organizations. That is very good thing for us because they can coordinate by themselves. Of course, not all, so we can support them. But mainly, firstly, they have make the action to coordinate, try to coordinate. And based on that activity, we can support. That is a very important thing, I guess. Sometimes, of course, we won't do firstly by ourselves, but that is not, how can I say, not good thing to Sri Lankan people, because if we can do, they cannot do. They don't become good partner with us. So that point is very important, I guess. So the coordination, of course, including our partner developer, but also that country's members are very important, I think. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Yuri. One of the things that I'm aware that both JICA and the World Bank have done is they've developed roadmaps for countries. I mean, with helping countries to have a long range plan. And I'd like to basically ask all of you just your views of how everyone can get behind a kind of a single design, so that there are, if we're thinking about a 15-year long roadmap for development, can we all work effectively around a single plan, or help evolve that plan and add, contribute to it in a more structured way, perhaps than we do at the moment? Any thoughts on that?
Thank you very much. So especially in Sri Lanka, I remember that firstly the JICA has a big master plan, but of course there are so many time going and now the updating the necessary. So based on our JICA master plan, next action was done by World Bank. I think. Yeah, we discussed with between, of course, not only the World Bank but also the USA, and we how can I say, we make separate master plan. So that area is done by World Bank, and that other area is done by JICA or something like that. We always coordinating with each other, and now there's some area not only by us but also the World Bank and the other coordination. So based on, maybe that is frankly speaking, there are some budget limitation or something like that. So we have to do that, but that is also good coordination, I thought. So yeah, I'd like to hear about other partners' opinion.
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. I think our organization is not tends not to get too involved in that type of planning process, and I would like to really support what Yuri has mentioned about it is the government's responsibility largely to coordinate and to make sure this makes sense to them. And so, and as Yuri has said, a lot of times they'll need help with that in terms of the planning process, but it's their plan. And it has to be something that makes sense to them and it is things they want. For us, it can be, we tend not to get into that because you have to be honest that we probably won't have a lot of resources to support a large portion of the plan. So it may be more useful for other donors to taking the leadership role on that. And especially the World Bank, for example, especially if the country is borrowing money to do something. But even if they're grants, they tend to be larger than the type of programs we would do in this space. But we're very supportive of those types of plans. Often, as Yuri has mentioned, the budget can be a problem. And so sometimes, I mean, we've seen plans, especially in the disaster management agencies that may have been developed by the UN or the World Bank, and there are pretty long lists of different activities that can be difficult to support. They can be either everything, and then of course you can find a space to support, or they might have priorities that our organization, for example, might not be able to provide much support to. So I certainly encourage the planning process, and just in terms of the countries themselves, thinking through what they feel they need and how to get there. But it will always be a negotiation as priorities and resources can be difficult, especially when it comes to middle-income countries. For example, the Sri Lanka cases can be a difficult one at times to argue, and for resources when other countries may be less able to do things on their own. But again, it all can be helpful for coordination and for conversation. So those kind of plans actually are always very interesting. We're always, I guarantee you, we'll always look at them and talk to the government about them. And the other thing that I might add is that sometimes opportunities come out that may be outside of the plan, and especially in something like forecasting where new technologies emerge. I would encourage the plan. I would also encourage countries to look at, hey, there may be a different option. If Google comes up with a new approach to integrating flood forecasts with warnings for people, they need to be listened to because their reach is tremendous. So we have to be open. And I think we need to encourage countries and as well as development partners to be open to new technologies. And what I find is that the hydromet agencies in particular really want that. They really want to be, they want to be connected to the latest technologies. So let's not not try to lock in that planning, but it is a great place to start to think and discuss about what's the most effective way really to use early warning to reduce the impacts of hydrometeorological hazards. So we're definitely, I think, very supportive, but you're probably not going to see us leading some kind of planning effort.
I mean, it says a lot about that it's a dynamic process, so that it's really an evolving thing. I mean, a plan is not fixed in stone, and so it's a mechanism in which everybody's having a conversation about what needs to be done. And I take to heart the point that you've just made about technology is rapidly changing, new players are entering the field, and you have to pay attention to that. Priyanka, what are your thoughts?
I think with this rapid technology change, collaboration from north, south, south, south would be very important. So we have to facilitate this interaction of different disaster management authorities at different levels, as well as within the region and outside the region, and looking at the developments and adapting them to suit the local condition. So having the long-term vision is also important in this regard. After 15 years, what would be the hydrometeorological services want to be, and from now onwards, and is it a development country's hydromet network that you want to establish? And having this long-term vision will help them to have an action plan, and then to secure investments and to have them on ground.
Right, thanks, Priyanka. So finally, I'd like to just move our thinking to what we can do regionally, and particularly the role of the South Asia Hydromet Forum. It's focused for the most part on encouraging countries in the region to work together. And in the future, this may lead to regional investment in hydromet infrastructure, cloud computing, cooperation on observation networks, and so on. Your respective agencies have played a formative role in the development of SAF. And as we've heard, you also have a significant country-level investments. Do you see a role for SAF in strengthening country-level activities? An example might be creating a shared pool of radar meteorology experts, for example, or maybe sharing numerical modeling facilities, reducing the need for investment in national infrastructure. Could development partners support this kind of regionalization? And if so, how? Priyanka, let's start with you. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, because as I recall, the bank initiated the Hydromet Forum because initially this effort was coordinated by South Asia SESCOF. So as a follow-up to the SESCOF, the bank initiated South Asia Hydromet Forum, where all the countries participate and share. So having a regional integrated approach would be definitely helpful for the countries, because countries are at different stages of this hydromet facilities. So having that platform would be very helpful. The national investments will be required, but there can be regional investments for multiple countries. And also the resources or the technologies developed can also be at the regional level. So these systems can be, say, for example, South Asia flat flood system. That's a regional level system, but most of the countries can use it. Then having both the national investment is also required, but having the regional investment and the platforms and systems will have that extra layer where the countries can benefit in the region.
Thanks. Yuri, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I'd like to mention, but not large scale, but small scale, because in Sri Lanka, I feel I could work with David, Priyanka. Of course, I thought Michael, the good coordination through the daily communication. So because after seeing each other, I know your face, I know your character, so I always can communicate with phone or email. And of course, you also always communicate with me. That's very important for our communication, the coordination. Yeah, of course, the world scale, for example, conference or some other activities are very important, I think. And also, daily communication is very, very important, I guess. For example, in this field, for example, there's some homepage in the we means, for example, Priyanka, Michael, David, Faith, photo in homepage, and some message please contact always or something like that. Based on that information, we can communicate daily or something like that. That is also important for coordination, I guess. So not a large scale communication, but the small scale communication also important, I think. Yeah, that's it.
No, that's a very good point. Michael.
A very good point indeed. The issue of regionalization has been an interesting one for us. We're a bilateral donor, but we also support regional programs. So in this case, the issue of regionalization and sharing of technological resources is a very interesting issue for the role of the South Asia Hydromet Forum in particular. And as I've said before, it's been wonderful in terms of helping us all meet and get organized and talk to each other and have this South-South sharing as well. Those kind of connections are great in that forum. We have definitely seen the potential for regionalization with our support for the WMO flash flood guidance system, which serves Sri Lanka as well as the rest of the South Asia region. And it's part of a global system, so and it is designed to be implemented regionally. So there's been great success in that. And then as countries that are maybe have more capacity to lead and train others, you can do that regionally. It's been quite successful in that manner. Okay, so as forecasting, especially when we're talking about modern forecasting, it depends on global to regional to local models. So it makes sense to share modeling resources at appropriate scales. It's also important to remember that local knowledge, data, and experience on hydrometeorology are critical in increasing accuracy of forecasts for timely and reliable warnings. Okay, countries will have to develop trust in the reliability and availability of models at the global and regional scales to ensure that any smaller scale models they may implement at national and subnational scales have useful boundary conditions. So there has to be a tremendous amount of trust there that's developed. And I think, again, the South Asia Hydromet Forum can help generate and improve that trust. This approach will have to be careful not to leave countries out of the scientific and technological breakthroughs. You do hear some concerns from countries. It's like, hey, we're very interested in artificial intelligence, for example. And it's very important that countries understand the science behind the information provided to them regionally or globally, and are thus equipped to experiment with different technologies within their own countries. They may not have to, they may not even have the resources to try to duplicate those technologies, but they must understand them. And I think that's a very important part of the trust. So regional gatherings like SAF can be an excellent forum for sharing the experience with existing and new technologies, as well as promoting cooperation on transboundary hazards. So again, that South-South cooperation is facilitated. Donors in those fora can actually take the back seat and listen, and really, and then we can meet privately and say, hey, what do you think about this? Is there something we can do to make that work better? So there is a role for these informal coordinations with donors, but the leadership should come from the region and from the national hydromet services themselves. And one thing for all countries to remember is that having reliable regional and global models provided to you means that you should have more resources available to focus on the most important part of an end-to-end early warning system, which only national governments can do, and that's developing the messages that enable effective early action to reduce hazard impacts. So no other country, no regional institution is going to be able to work locally to make sure evacuations take place. That is up to the countries themselves, and that needs to be understood, that the more technology they can take advantage of globally or regionally, the more they can focus on making sure that technology does the most to help their own citizens. So that's a very important thing. Now, regional organizations can assist with these efforts, but the real capacity for local action has to be developed locally, and that's where more focus is required by all of the national hydromet agencies. And again, the South Asia Hydromet Forum and RIMES, they've both shown tremendous ability to support national governments in this whole end-to-end chain and the whole value chain. So very good, as you talked about long-term planning, that notion that that in the end, it's how well these early warning systems reduce disaster impacts and help save lives. That actually generates the value for the whole system and allows donors as well as national governments to support these systems and make longer term plans.
Thank you, Michael. So finally, I'd just like to thank all of you for sharing your experience with the South Asia Hydromet Forum, and thanks very much.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks again to all our guests. As we've seen, the role of development partners is quite varied, from providing technical assistance to large-scale investment and various permutations of the two. Client countries are not simply passive beneficiaries. They have a role in improving the effectiveness of this investment of money and effort by promoting cooperation among development partners. One idea is to create national and regional roadmaps for long-term development and investment that evolve with changing circumstances and encouraging partners to contribute to the best of their ability. As always, you can find out more about the South Asia Hydromet Forum by visiting the GFDRR website or the SAF Knowledge Hub. Thanks for watching.